Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, welcome. Welcome to the 23rd Geneva Security Debate on nuclear arms control, reflecting on the past and looking to the future. Let me start with a technical remark. If you don't want to be filmed, you should sit in this part of the room. If you're fine, you can sit wherever you choose. Thank you for your understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, our Geneva Security Debates consist of public discussions on current security challenges, bringing together leading thinkers and practitioners in interactive discussions. Geneva Security Debates inform policymakers here in international Geneva, as well as beyond, providing new insights and a better understanding of today's security challenges in order to build a better, a more equitable, sustainable, and peaceful future. Our event today comes at a time when there are no nuclear arms control negotiations and when there is hardly any dialogue, in particular, no official or hardly any official dialogue on nuclear arms. The P5 process set up for the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT treaty to discuss the key issues under the treaty, including nuclear disarmament, is meeting, yes, and that is a good thing, but it is not going beyond meetings on the working level and is limited in what it can achieve under current political circumstances. The last remaining bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, the New START Treaty, will terminate in February 2026. If it expires with no new agreement, there will be no binding limits on the world's largest nuclear arsenals. The overall context is as challenging as it has never been. Nuclear arsenals are being modernized and, in some cases, expanded. Nuclear proliferation concerns persist in Northeast Asia and in the Middle East. Rhetoric threatening the use of nuclear weapons is increasing. In today's polarized world, where opportunities for dialogue are scarce, we at the GCSP still manage to provide at least some platforms for discussing these difficult issues on the track 2 and 1.5 levels. We have a US-Russia dialogue on strategic stability. We conduct a P5 track 2 roundtable on nuclear risk reduction, currently focusing on the nexus between N3C and AI. And we are developing new initiatives on space security and US-China dialogue on strategic stability. Now, let us turn to today's topic of nuclear arms control. To help us address this crucial question for our future security, I'm delighted to welcome to the GCSP former senior US and NATO official, Ms Gottemoeller. Rose is currently the William J. Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Before joining Stanford, Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And in that capacity, I had the privilege of working together with her when I was Secretary General of the OSCE. Prior to NATO, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US Department of State, advising the Secretary of State on arms control, non-proliferation, and political military affairs. While Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance, in 2009 and 2010. She was the chief US negotiator on the new strategic arms reduction treaty, New START, with the Russian Federation. Prior to her government service, she was a senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, with joint appointments to the non-proliferation and the Russia programs. She served as a director of the Carnegie Moscow Center from 2006 to 2008 and is currently a non-resident fellow in Carnegie's nuclear policy program. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon's event will start with Rose talking to us on the topic of nuclear arms control, reflecting on the past and looking to the future. Following this, we will then move to Q&A, which I will moderate. And we welcome questions both from you here in the room as well as from those participating online. I'm now very pleased to hand the floor over to you, Rose. We are really honored to have you with us today, and we are looking forward to hearing your insights on the state of play in nuclear arms control. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. It's a real honor and pleasure to see you all here. It has been a while since I spoke to the Munich Security Forum, yes, also the Geneva Center for Security Policy. It was when this institution was in the old building close by, and so it's really wonderful to see these beautiful new facilities and to understand how this institution is going from strength to strength. So congratulations to you, Ambassador Greminger, and to all your staff for that. So I wanted to do two things today. First of all, I wanted to talk about an important document that came out this time last year, and that was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's speech that he gave to the Arms Control Association. It was exactly 1 year ago. And it had some important messages in it. But then I also wanted to go from there and to talk about the Strategic Posture Commission report. You may recollect that I was a member of the Strategic Posture Commission, which was a congressional commission convened in the United States. It was 6 members from the Republican Party, 6 members from the Democratic Party. I was one of the 6 Democratic commissioners, and we came up with a consensus decision. Now, this report has dropped into the debate internationally in a way that I think is important. It has raised a lot of issues about where the United States may go from here with its nuclear arsenal, but I also wanted to point out some ways that it can, I think, guide and sustain policy also on the arms control front. So I will talk about both of those topics today, but I'm going to start with Jake Sullivan's speech, which I just asked the U.S. mission to print off this morning and reread today because it's 1 year old. And I thought it really does serve as a good basis for at least beginning our discussion today, because Jake made several important points. First of all, he was clear and unequivocal. We are in the midst of a geopolitical, geostrategic crisis at the moment. At that time, clearly there was already the Russian invasion of Ukraine had taken place. We were not yet to the point where there was a crisis in the Middle East with the terrible situation in Gaza, so many Palestinians and Israelis suffering. So the geostrategic crisis that Jake Sullivan was talking about this time last summer has only been augmented since June of last year with a continuing crisis and many deaths and much suffering in the Middle East as well. So we are in a very difficult time and a very difficult place, but yet he spoke about the necessity of continuing to work on arms control goals. And he did so in 3 ways. First of all, although he regretted that Russia had ceased to implement the New START treaty in February of 2023, he said that the United States is ready to come back to the table again without preconditions. And Russia had already stated that as long as the US remained in the limits of the New START treaty, that it would stay in the limits of the New START treaty. So the United States, and Jake Sullivan said this, as long as Russia stays in the limits of the New START treaty, the United States will stay in the limits of the New START treaty. And that was significant because he said, yes, those limits should stay in place up to February of 2026, which is when the New START treaty will go out of force according to its terms after its extension. But he also said, as long as Russia stays within the limits of the treaty, the United States will stay within the limits of the treaty. So even beyond February of 2026, from the US point of view, as long as Russia remains within the treaty, the United States will remain inside the treaty. Just to remind you, the limitations in the treaty are 700 nuclear delivery vehicles operational. That's 700 ICBMs, sea-launched ballistic missiles, bombers and their weapons, and 1,550 operationally deployed warheads. So those are the central limits of the New START treaty, as well as 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers. So that's essentially what Jake Sullivan put on the table. And I'm going to talk about that some more today, but I think that was a very good message for a year ago in June and continues to be a good message now. The other point that he made in this speech is that the United States is interested in talking to China about their nuclear modernization. According to the US Department of Defense, the Chinese are modernizing. They are building up their nuclear warhead numbers from about 500 today, and within the next 11 years or so, by 2035, to build up their warhead holdings to 1,500 total. That's the Department of Defense estimate. Clearly, the Chinese are building up nuclear numbers, so we don't know exactly where they're going to land. But at the same time, Jake Sullivan said, and I quote, "The US does not need to increase our nuclear forces to outnumber the combined total of our competitors in order to deter them," unquote. That was a very, very important message. I thought that this is not just an arithmetic problem. Russia has 1,550 warheads deployed under New START. China builds up to 1,500. Suddenly, the United States needs 3,051. You know, it's not an arithmetic problem. There are a number of factors that contribute to deterrence. And again, I'll come back to that when I talk about the Strategic Posture Commission report, but you can't make a simple numerical calculation as to how to proceed with sustaining deterrence. So that was another important message, and linked to that was also this point, stressed with the Russians, that the United States is ready to engage with China also without preconditions. So I thought this speech was very good in laying out a number of important messages in that regard, and I refer you to it today to look at. There's clearly a big debate going on in Washington about how to proceed. I'm going to turn to the Strategic Posture Commission in a minute. But meanwhile, I want to stress for you, for this audience, that in my view, a lot can happen between now and 2026. People are saying the arms control regime is fraying. No question, it's fraying. A lot has happened, a lot of implementation problems in recent years. And so we've had a lot of, the treaties have basically gone away, conventional as well as nuclear. So again, I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A period if you like. But I think that we should not say that the end has already arrived and there's no hope for the future, because as I see it, actually, we can negotiate a new agreement by that time if Russia should decide to come back to the negotiating table. If the political will is there, and that goes for both sides as well, there has to be political will based on mutual and reciprocal interests. The preamble to the New START treaty talks about indivisible security. I know that's a line on many lips around Geneva, but the United States and the Russian Federation agreed that New START and strategic arms control overall must be based on mutual security, mutual interests, indivisible security. So I think that's another important point. And so as long as the political will is there, I think we can move forward with new negotiations. Certainly, historically, when times have been bad, when we have been shooting at each other in regional wars. I remember from when I first got started in this business in the early 1970s, at that point, Soviet technical experts were helping the North Vietnamese shoot down US fighter pilots over Hanoi in the midst of the Vietnam War. And yet we were pursuing what was the SALT I agreement, negotiations on the SALT I agreement. So we have certainly been able to engage on nuclear arms control, even in the midst of very, very difficult circumstances overall. So, long story short, I hold out hope that we can resume negotiations and achieve a new treaty by the time New START goes out of force in February of 2026. That said, I think it will be complicated more for the political reasons and the fact that we are clearly at a nadir in our bilateral relationships, again, for very good reasons because of our differences over the invasion of Ukraine. But in technical terms, I believe it should not be too difficult to negotiate a replacement because New START served as a very good framework. We had a very effective and an operating monitoring and verification regime before Russia suspended implementation of the New START treaty in February of 2023. That means no more on-site inspection, no more data exchange, no more exchange of information about our strategic force movements and operations on a day-in, day-out basis through the notification regime of the treaty. So that functioning verification regime has halted as of this point, but it was operating pretty well at the time that the plug was pulled. I will say, of course, there were differences over implementation. As I understand it, the United States was getting ready to present to the Russian side some ideas for solving some of the problems that Russia had with US implementation. But that's what happens with these treaties. In the course of implementation, issues, problems come up. Sometimes they take a long time to resolve, but that's why another aspect of the treaty implementation is the so-called bilateral consultative commission, the implementation body of the treaty, which can meet regularly to try to work out issues that come up in implementation of the treaty. So all of these mechanisms were operating pretty well when the plug was pulled on New START implementation. So frankly, yeah, we'll have some new issues to wrestle with in a new negotiation, and the United States is keen to get some constraints, direct constraints on warheads, deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic warheads. And so that will be complicated. We've never tried to directly constrain warheads in a strategic arms reduction treaty. We've always constrained the large hardware, the ICBMs, things that you can see from outer space with satellite. And we've never tried to place direct limits on warheads. But I think we've advanced enough now in our monitoring and verification activities, including our reentry vehicle on-site inspection under New START, that we have some opportunities to work out monitoring for warheads. And many countries here in Geneva, many of you perhaps around this room, have been involved in the IPNDV, which is an initiative that has been looking at technical means and measures to monitor warheads directly. So I think a lot of work has gone on. These are things that will be complicated to negotiate, but nevertheless, we have a good framework. We have a good foundation stone in the New START treaty. But let me take the worst case here. By the time, oh, by the way, the NPT review conference this year is going to be in 2026, just a couple of months after the New START treaty goes out of force, if it does go out of force. So it's going to be a critical year to think clearly about what we can do, come what may, to continue to bolster the disarmament pillar of the NPT. In my view, even in the worst case, that we and the Russians cannot get back to the table, we cannot keep moving forward, we should still try to reiterate on a parallel basis that we will both, each of us will sustain the limits of the New START treaty into the future, beyond February of 2026, as long as the other side sustains those limits. Furthermore, I think, frankly, it would be good if all the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, the P5 or the N5, joined in this activity in this way precisely, and that is the US and Russia make their parallel statements sustaining the limits of the New START Treaty, and the additional nuclear weapon states, UK, France, and China, make individual statements saying that they will do nothing to undermine the central limits of the New START Treaty. All of these would be, of course, unilateral statements, not legally binding, but I think they could have importance in the context of the NPT review conference, and in the case of also ensuring that we continue to think about the future of disarmament, nuclear disarmament, and sustaining the strength of the non-proliferation treaty regime. Now, another topic that's been discussed a lot, including here at GCSP, is the whole area and arena of nuclear risk reduction. I wanted to say one thing to this audience, and that is I think that the risk reduction contribution cannot replace nuclear disarmament. It cannot replace nuclear disarmament. Strategic risk reduction is important only insofar as it contributes to disarmament goals among the P5. And that's something I really want to stress. By the way, I should have said this at the beginning. I don't have any instructions here today. I'm not coming from the US government. I am a researcher now at Stanford University. You are hearing my personal opinions, my own views. But let me talk about how I think about risk reduction. It must contribute to disarmament goals. It must contribute to strengthening the disarmament pillar of the NPT. So just a couple of examples of what the P5 and 5 might consider. No first use and exploration of the Chinese proposal in that regard, discussing what the Chinese have in mind. Second, detargeting, a reiteration of the past P5 and 5 commitments with regard to detargeting. And as far as I know, the Russian and US commitments to detargeting of our strategic nuclear forces is still on the books. And it's been reiterated from time to time publicly by both Moscow and Washington. Third, missile launch notifications. To my mind, that should be a no-brainer. And it's something that is already out there in terms of HCOC and how HCOC is implemented. But it's something I think that the E5N5 could embrace in a more explicit and specific way, with some perhaps procedures to go along with it, rather than it being handled in a more ad hoc manner. And finally, renewal of the glossary project under the P5N5. I get a lot of criticism of the glossary project. I have for all the years I was involved, including as the US representative to the P5 process. But I'll tell you one thing, the very first thing you do when you sit down and start to negotiate an arms control agreement is you start working on definitions, agreed definitions. So to my mind, the very serious work that is going on in the glossary project serves two purposes. Serves the purposes of enhancing mutual understanding of strategic stability concepts. That's important in its own right in the context of the doctrine discussions that the P5N5 are undertaking. And it's an early kind of building block for eventual negotiations. It could, be a building block for eventually moving in the direction of an agreement of some kind. Of course, it's self-standing in its own right as a confidence-building risk reduction measure, but definitions agreed in that way could in the future contribute to a negotiating process. So I did want to talk about risk reduction, but before I give up the floor and turn to our discussion, I did want to say one thing about this document. This is a large form of the Strategic Posture Commission report. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, it's on the website of the Institute for Defense Analyses, IDA. So that's, I think it's www.ida for sure.org. But they were our executive secretariat for this. It was very important because it was a bipartisan consensus in the context of a very rough political environment in Washington, clearly. 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. We managed to get to consensus. Nobody ever thought we could. By the way, also 6 women and 6 men, equally divided, Republicans and Democrats. So I get the feeling that maybe having the women on the group might have helped us to get to consensus. I'm not sure about that, but we had Republicans as well as Democrats among the women. So that was very, very good. But I do think that it has been misunderstood in a bit because it's simply been read as a recipe for building up U.S. nuclear forces. But that's not at all what the report says. And I would urge you, if you've had that opinion, to read it very carefully. Because the very first recommendation doesn't mention nuclear weapons at all. It says, and I quote, "The United States must develop and effectively implement a truly integrated whole of government strategy to address the 2027 to 2035 threat environment." And that was our window for this report. So it's important, that notion of whole of government, because it takes in, it's not just about the strategic forces. It's not just about the conventional forces. It's not just about the Pentagon. It's about the entire government of the United States of America, including very much our Department of State and our statecraft. And that is the basic conclusion upon which this report and recommendation upon which this report was built. It does say that the United States is facing the potential of a 2 nuclear peer threat, with the buildup that we see coming from China, as well as the modernization now complete of the Russian strategic nuclear forces. But at the moment, we don't see much except the notion of a tough and uncompromising stance from the Russian side, concerned about the Chinese buildup, not hearing much from them about what their objectives are. So the worst case conclusion is the United States may be facing a 2 nuclear peer situation in the period, again, of the report, which went out to 2035. It also speaks to the program of record for the U.S. nuclear modernization, which is a triad modernization for the ground-based, sea-based, and air-based legs of the triad that was first agreed by President Obama in 2016. And the program of record is now being implemented. Its implementation extends between now and 2035. So the report did recommend that we must think about and plan for a time when we are not able to make any change in the direction of travel of Russia and China, and they are still, it seems, on a path of threatening us with their nuclear forces. Then we may need to think about increasing the numbers of nuclear weapons. But that increase is not now. It's not in this decade. Essentially, what the Strategic Posture Commission says is that the program of record for our strategic nuclear forces is necessary, but may not be sufficient. Necessary. And with that goes the message that we must complete implementing the program of record without any change, without reopening it, without trying to add new tasks onto it. In essence, what President Obama planned, which is modernizing the triad under the limits of the New START Treaty, under the limits of 700 delivery vehicles and 1,550 warheads, not building up under those limits, that those limitations should be, part and parcel of how we think about the triad modernization. But then, if necessary, after 2035, we must be ready to make further decisions if there has been no change in the aggressive posture that we see from Russia and from China, if there's no change in the buildup that we see from China with no explanation forthcoming. So what I like to really emphasize, and I'd like to confirm this message for this audience and emphasize it today, as I see it, we essentially have a window of opportunity for the next decade between now and 2035, where we have an opportunity to come back to the negotiating table and engage in the necessary statecraft to effect further controls and constraints on nuclear arsenals, all nuclear arsenals. And so, of course, the Russian and US arsenals remain larger. And so, in my mind, we have a special responsibility to continue to control and reduce our arsenals. But I think we need to get China to the table as well, in the first instance, to understand Chinese objectives for this fast-moving modernization that is going on, accompanied by a fast-moving buildup in numbers of nuclear warheads. So I think I have talked for enough time, and I look forward to joining Thomas up on the stage, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
This was a lot less gloomy than I had expected, I must say.
I'm often accused of being a perennial optimist, but in this case, I do think there's an argument to be made, as you could hear.
Yeah, that's how I got to know you, yes. You just attended the official P5 expert meeting. You know, can you share with us what the mood was?
Let me explain. The P5, N5 process, of course, has been going on since 2009. I attended the first of those meetings, accompanying my then boss, Undersecretary Ellen Tauscher, who led the US delegation at that time. Sadly, Ellen has left us. When she passed on, I then entered into the Undersecretary position as her successor. So it's been going on now for quite a long time, over a decade, and it has gone through, again, various ups and downs. At the moment, and it cycles through chairs. So UK was first, then the US, or it might have been France next. I forget what the order is. It doesn't matter. So at the moment, Russia is in the chair of the P5, and they, to their credit, convened an expert group of so-called senior experts. There is already a young persons or a young experts group associated with the P5 that has been in place for several years, and there might be some members around the room here. But this is the first time we've had a more senior expert group, and it's all people like me, very experienced people who have been working for their governments for a number of years and are now out of government, doing other jobs or working in academia. So we got together in a very quiet and nice place last Thursday, Friday, up in Glion above Montreux. And those of you who have been involved in the Middle East, weapons of mass destruction free zone issues over the years know that too was an important venue for that particular set of issues. But we met and discussed Thursday, Friday, what is coming up in the P5 agenda, discussing all three pillars of the NPT and what we should be doing about all three of them. It was, you're right, I'm not going to talk about the substance, but I will say it was a very, very workmanlike atmosphere, as we like to say in the diplomatic world, pragmatic, professionally, respectful of each other. We all knew what our differences were, but everybody was looking for good ideas to put on the table for the PrepCom that will be coming up. And also, of course, since the chairmanship will be passing from Russia to China, looking for good ideas to suggest to the Chinese chair as the PrepCom approaches, and then into the next year as we prepare for the NPT review conference. So all in all, I thought it was a really high quality discussion. And again, I give credit to the Russians for having come up with the idea and implemented it.
Yeah. You said, and I think that is, the optimistic perspective. You said we have now an opportunity, a window of opportunity for about a decade. This would imply that, the US, the Russian Federation, China are able to kind of compartmentalize strategic stability from, the geopolitical rivalry, from bad bilateral relations, from the war against Ukraine. Is that a realistic perspective?
Well, you know what? like transparency in certain circles, compartmentalization has now gotten a dirty name to it because, you know, in certain settings, and I would say specifically Moscow has been arguing quite often that compartmentalization means the US is not considering Russia's larger security concerns. Well, I would argue that we have a dominant security concern in addressing the existential threat of nuclear weapons. And yes, we have severe differences over European security, what is going on with regard to the war in Ukraine. We have severe differences over that. But we also have, to my mind, a governing responsibility to address the existential threat of nuclear weapons. And that has been the thought since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought us to the brink of nuclear annihilation. I mean, we were right at the edge in 1962, and that gave a short, sharp shock to Moscow and to Washington to get to the negotiating table and start to negotiate. First, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, then the Non-Proliferation Treaty, SALT I, ABM Treaty, eventually getting on to what became after the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So we were able to accomplish a lot. And oh, never mind the continuing parade of US, Soviet, and US, Russian bilateral treaties culminating in the New START Treaty. But we were able to continue working no matter what. And I think it's common sense to be back there again, but it's not at the moment where the Kremlin is at. So I think we should start to think about, in my view, articulating this more and more as an area, again, of mutual security, of indivisible security, as something that really is part and parcel of how we continue to assure our own security status, environment in the world, and our own defense and deterrence of others, is to continue to work these issues. So it's a mutual interest. But again, that's not where things are right now. So is it practical? I don't know. But here's another area where I think both past precedent and common sense should drive us in the same direction of getting back to the negotiating table.
So it basically has to happen because it's so vital for mankind's survival.
Nuclear weapons are an existential threat. So yes, I think we need to keep talking. At the moment, sadly, we're not talking at all, which is not a good situation.
You talked about I'll be opening up in a few minutes, but let me abuse the privilege of moderating this discussion for another moment. You talked about New START post February 2026, and you said the way forward is basically unilaterally declaring that one will stick to the limits, right? In parallel, yeah. Now, at the essence of nuclear arms control has always been monitoring verification, right? And now this is already now off. And the question, that I would ask is then, how sustainable can that be, sticking, basically unilaterally declaring that you stick to limits without having any monitoring verification? For how long will that hold?
Well, historically, we have depended on national technical means of verification anyway. These are our large satellites, over-the-horizon radars, other ways that we control essentially the technical platforms that allow us to monitor large items of hardware. And mercifully, the New START Treaty, like the treaties before it, is based on monitoring large items of hardware, bombers, submarines, missiles that you can see from outer space. And we are now helped also by the advent of a large array of commercial imagery satellites that bolster national technical means and give us some additional information, some additional imagery that bolsters confidence. So, and by the way, they are images that are commercially available, so it's equally available to both the United States and Russia. So, to make a long story short, I think we can go on for quite long. We did the same at the time in the 1980s of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when Jimmy Carter pulled the SALT II treaty back from the Senate, and it never entered into force. But through all that rough period in the early 1980s, up until Reagan and Gorbachev got together and the INF treaty negotiations ensued and the START treaty negotiations ensued. But for most of that decade, we had this kind of a situation where we both agreed to abide by the limits of SALT II without it actually being in force. I'm not endorsing this precedent, believe me. I'd much rather get back to a verification regime, full implementation of the treaty, which also involves, as I said, exchanging regular notifications about what we're doing with our strategic forces. If the US takes an ICBM out of a silo and takes it to a maintenance facility, we had to tell the Russians, and the Russians had to tell us. So we had many, many notifications passing back and forth between Moscow and Washington every week. And I'd love to get back to that again. It's the best way to ensure confidence.
You referred to this threat of two nuclear peers. Well, this begs obviously the question of how to engage China in the years to come. I think many experts, would argue that to get China on board of a treaty, that is just not going to happen in the years to come. I heard you suggest at a major conference last year to go for softer commitments that are below the hard law level. For instance, trying to engage China on intermediate range nuclear weapons. Is that something that you believe could be a potential way forward?
To be honest, Thomas, I'm not sure I'm remembering exactly what I proposed at this time last year at a conference, but what I do think nowadays is that because of this dual use missile issue that we're seeing played out before our eyes in Ukraine, where we're really concerned about dual capable missiles, potentially the threat of nuclear use in Ukraine. It's the time to start thinking about disentangling dual use systems. And a good way to do that would actually be to put in place moratoria in Europe and in Asia on nuclear armed intermediate range missiles. I don't think China's going to want to stop deploying intermediate range ground launch missiles. I don't think Russia's going to want to stop deploying intermediate range ground launch missiles. They're too effective, as we can see, sadly, not only in the war in Ukraine, but also in the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria in recent years. So I think there are good reasons to think about ways to constrain nuclear armed intermediate range missiles, what I call putting the N back in INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, putting a real N in INF, because INF was a ban on all such missiles, nuclear and conventional, because we could not distinguish between them. Now, again, I think we have enough tools available for monitoring and verification that we could distinguish between them. We could exclude deployment of nuclear armed intermediate range missiles. So that's what we should be going for. But that's a serious arms control negotiation. That's not a confidence building measure or a unilateral measure. That's a serious negotiation.
So are you saying that this is for later?
I'm saying that might be a way to begin earlier rather than later to interest both Russia and China in a negotiation, because the US and the deployment complaints have been out there. The US has been bringing conventionally armed ground launched cruise missiles to Asia, for example, for exercise purposes, to Europe for exercise purposes. And we've been hearing complaints from both Beijing and Moscow about it. Okay, well, let's figure out how we can begin to get some constraints in this area that would make good sense for everybody's defense and security interests. And by the way, it's interesting to me that the one time I know of that Xi Jinping has actually mentioned anything specific about an interest in a negotiation was when in February of 2022, right before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met in Beijing. That was their statement about friendship without limits. But if you read that long statement, they also talk about negotiating a moratorium in Asia and a moratorium in Europe on intermediate range missiles. So that's the one time I know about where Xi Jinping ever mentioned any negotiation that he was interested in. He and Putin decreed at the time that their experts should get together and do further consideration and planning of this matter. I've never heard of anybody actually doing it, but I think it's, you know, it's an indicator that it could be in the interests of both countries. And by the way, in October of 2020, Vladimir Putin put an interesting proposal on the table for a moratorium on European INF, and I think that proposal is well worth looking at as a possible future basis for negotiation.
What would be then the appropriate format to negotiate that? I suppose the P5 format could perhaps prepare the ground, but would not be an appropriate format to negotiate.
Oh, I see two parallel negotiations, one for Europe and one for Asia, in my opinion.
Okay. A last question before I open it up. There has been, since February 2022, there has been a lot of nuclear saber rattling. How do you assess, you know, the risk of escalation? There has been reference to using tactical nuclear arms. Is this saber rattling, or is this to be taken seriously?
I think you have to take, when the president of a country indicates that nuclear weapons could be in play, and then many of those around him develop that thought in sometimes quite disastrous ways, with specific threats against NATO allied capitals such as London taking place. It's very worrisome, and so I think we must take this seriously, and I find it extremely worrying. So yes, I think we have to pay attention to it, and I do think that it really goes to show once again how nuclear deterrence is evolving since we thought about it in the 1950s. And, you know, early in my career, I worked at Rand Corporation. So 1950s, that's where the original game theories were developed that talked about nuclear deterrence and deterrence ladders and things like that. Well, it's evident to me from the war in Ukraine that deterrence is not a ladder straight up and down. There's other things going on here, and escalatory moves followed by de-escalatory moves. It's very, very difficult in a theoretical way to get your arms around it right now. But I do think the one thing must be true, and we must remember at all times, that we've had a taboo on the use of nuclear weapons for 80 years, almost 80 years at this point, since the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. That was the last use by the United States of nuclear weapons in wartime. And the United States, for its part, is determined that this taboo on nuclear weapons in wartime remains in place. And I say that not as an official, but just because the memory of that, the historical memory of that decision to use weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki bear heavy on U.S. decision-making in this regard, in a positive way in terms of our pursuit of disarmament goals over all these years, as well as in the way of the U.S. not being the one who's going to head down that path unless forced to. As the U.S. has said, and its NATO allies repeatedly, the chance of nuclear weapons being used is extremely remote, and it's not something that anyone should choose.
I would now like to open up our conversation. Please raise your hand and briefly introduce yourself. And first I will take questions one by one, but at some point I might then be obliged to cluster. The lady here, yes, please.
Sahar, I'm a NISC participant here in GCSP. My question is regarding the new technologies like AI. What are the efforts and the measures that are being taken into consideration to face and address the vulnerabilities that can appear in the nuclear command and control systems because of these new technologies?
Yes, that's a very important question, and it is one that I know that the P5 have been discussing among themselves. The United States has also put forward a statement asking others to join. It doesn't specifically treat, or it doesn't specifically deal with the nuclear question, but nevertheless, there is now afoot an effort to begin to develop the kind of normative foundations around which we consider the AI problem. But front and center has been the effort of the P5, the N5, to exclude AI in nuclear command and control systems without having a human in the loop. And so I think that it seems to be an area where there's quite a bit of agreement among the P5. So I would hope that will be an early area where there can be some formal agreement. But honestly, everything is very fast moving in this world of innovation and technology development, and AI is certainly one of the fastest moving areas of innovation. So it's hard for us to keep our arms around it. And it's not only nuclear command and control, it's other aspects of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence that are affected, I think, by the AI revolution. So this is an area I hope you are studying and preparing to, help us out as we move forward in this area.
Thank you.
So, did I understand you correctly? So this is something that you would discuss in the formal P5 expert?
As I understand, it has been discussed. Whether it can ever get to the point of being an agreement, I don't know.
Andre, Greminger. There is microphones in the ceiling.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you very much for your excellent talk. My first question is on the topic of China, but not just China. You paid a lot of attention to the fact of China and to the desire of the United States to involve China into nuclear talks. Russia thinks that it is important, but Russia raises the issue of nuclear arsenals of France and the United Kingdom. And there is a good reason for doing that, because if we take the end of the 80s, then the size of the nuclear arsenals of these two countries equaled approximately 4% of nuclear arsenals of the United States and the USSR. But now, and that calculations are according to the SALT II way of calculating things. If now we take the calculation on the basis of New START, then the nuclear arsenals of China and the United Kingdom equal more than 30% of nuclear arsenals of each Russia and the United States. So 4% and 30 plus are quite different figures. The question is, do you think that in the foreseeable future, it will be as much important to involve China in the bilateral or multilateral nuclear talks framework in comparison with the factor of involvement of France and the United Kingdom? And my second question is on the INF in Europe. You covered this topic, but still, now we discussed a lot the issue of the Typhoon medium-range capability. It was deployed in Philippines. You mentioned it twice in Europe, in Bornholm, And Russia made a very clear statement that if the system of, for example, Dark Eagle deployed later on the permanent basis, then Russia will leave its self-proclaimed moratorium. From my point of view, the problem is that it is very difficult to discern between nuclear-tipped and conventional tipped warheads. And we know that Tomahawks are subsonic, but if you take Dark Eagle, this is a very different weapon. So do you think that still there is a chance that the proposal which Russia put forward in 2020 and then enhanced in 2021 still may be salvaged? Thank you.
Sure. Interesting arithmetic, Andre. I think it's worthwhile remembering that as far as UK and France are concerned, each of them have numbers in the three figures, and China has numbers in the three figures too. So each of them individually has under 500 warheads each. US and Russia have 1,550 operationally deployed warheads, but the total numbers in each of our arsenals are 4,000 or more warheads. So the United States and Russia still by far outstrip UK, China, France in terms of the numbers and certainly in terms of the deployed numbers. But I note that there are various ways that deployments could be increased rather quickly. For example, and this is arcane and technical, but the bomber counting rule under New START is very permissive. So if Russia, for example, wanted to assign more warheads to its bomber force, it could do so rather easily by uploading bombers. So anyway, that's why I say there's a lot of creative arithmetic in every single direction, but it's worthwhile thinking about the different angles and what each country could actually have available to threaten the other if need be, because that's what the deterrence game is all about. But I did want to say also that the United States, UK, and France maintain absolutely separate command and control systems. And these nuclear weapons are under the authority solely of Paris and London. And so there's some idea out there that the United States commands Paris and London to, provide their nuclear weapons for US targeting purposes. That is completely not right. And so I do want to make sure that that's on the record. In fact, Charles de Gaulle would be turning in his grave if he could, get the idea that the US would command French nuclear targeting. It's not happening. On the INF front, I hope that President Putin's 2020 moratorium proposal is still on the table, because I thought it was a very clever proposal. There was a lot to think about there in terms of negotiating. It called for the US to keep these ground-launched cruise missiles that you mentioned concern out of Europe in return for Russia keeping out of Europe, keeping east of the Urals, the so-called 9M729 missile. That is the missile the US and its allies decided, and on the basis of good intelligence decided was a violation of the INF treaty. I have to say it was agreed across all the allies, and that's the reason why the Trump administration left the INF treaty. The determination was made that Russia was violating the treaty. That said, the Russian side has come back with this moratorium. The first version I saw when I was DSG at NATO was not acceptable. It was a one-sided proposal. Okay, you, the US, you engage a moratorium and keep your Glickums out of Europe. And I said, no, that's a one-sided proposal. But then again, to its credit, the Kremlin came back with an improved offer, which was to keep also the 9M729 out of Europe. So I think it's a really decent proposal upon which to negotiate. And that's one of the reasons why I think if we were to begin to negotiate again, I wouldn't necessarily start with New START and a replacement for New START. I'd start with working on INF because there's a basis upon which to work, I think.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm Georgia's permanent representative to Geneva. I'm former ambassador to NATO, and I had privilege and honor
Nice to see you again.
nice to see you again, to work with Honorable Madam Gottemoeller in my previous capacity. So I have two questions we mentioned achievements of past century and last decade of the 20th century was and is still widely considered as kind of golden era in disarmament and arms control. But some outcomes of that time could be assessed in a different way, especially after 30 years of the Budapest Memorandum. There could be a different assessment. And I'd like to ask you kind of a hypothetical question. What would happen if Ukraine had in its possession nuclear weapons? Could it serve as kind of additional means of deterrence today? And I would not miss this opportunity and ask you one more question concerning the future of conventional arms control, since all regimes are severely undermined, including the CFE Treaty, which once was considered as the cornerstone of the European security. So how will you see the future of the conventional arms control in Europe?
Right. Well, here, I'll just answer this question very, very quickly, because I think we're going to have to do a complete relook at the European security architecture. And it's not the moment now while we're in the midst of this terrible war in Ukraine. I do hope, talking about building blocks, I do hope we'll continue to have some building blocks available to us from the preceding regimes, which include not only CFE, but also the Vienna document, still in force, but difficult, if not impossible, to implement right now. And then we have as well the history of the Open Skies Treaty. So there's lessons learned, there's tools and instruments available from each of those, but it's gonna take, the end of this war and a resolution of the conflict for us to be able to get back to thinking about a comprehensive European security architecture. By the way, I'd like your view on that as well, Thomas, but in any event, I was one of the US team involved in the negotiation of the Budapest Memorandum back in 1993 and 1994. And so I've thought about your question long and hard. In the end of the day, I believe that nuclear weapons are weapons for leaving on the shelf. They're weapons for deterrence, and they do not really provide an overarching enhancement of security. But then I think about what would have happened if Ukraine had insisted back in 1993 and 1994 to hold on to its nuclear weapons at that point. At that point, it would have been technically complicated, complex, because the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, over 1,000, were tied to the centralized command and control system in Moscow. The Ukrainians would have had to guillotine that system and try to reestablish command and control in Kyiv. In that transition, there would have been so much instability and difficulty. And don't forget, both Russia and Ukraine were very fragile, newly independent states at that point, without solid governance systems, economies in complete upheaval, political systems unsettled. We could have ended up in an early war between Russia and Ukraine. And that is what the Clinton administration at the time was trying to avoid, to keep the countries of what we called then the NIS, the newly independent states, to keep them moving forward in basically on a reform path. And there's arguments about whether the reforms that the Clinton administration was pushing were good ones or not. But in any event, the idea was to help each of the countries emerge into independence, a sovereign state, healthy economies, political systems, moving towards stabilization. That was the dream anyway. And instead, to have the specter of war emerge. My view of this situation is that the Budapest Memorandum and the trilateral statement and the denuclearization of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus permitted each of those countries 30 years of development and establishment as independent and sovereign states. And you see the result in Ukraine today, with Ukraine fighting for its life against a much bigger foe, but as an independent sovereign state committed to its own nationhood. And that wouldn't have been possible, in my view, 30 years ago. So it's not a very satisfying answer, because you think sometimes nuclear weapons are the ultimate answer, but I don't believe in the end of the day they are a guarantee of security.
Online questions are coming in, and I don't want to discriminate our online audience, so I'm going to take two and then revert back to you. And the future of European security, I think, will report to a next Geneva Security Debate. That would be, as a matter of fact, some of us are leaving tonight to Vienna for a dialogue track involving 20 leading experts on exactly this question. But it's a difficult discussion for the reasons you just referred to. As long as this war is ongoing, it's very difficult to get your head around a European security order that is more than just an order directed against Russia. Let me read out an online question to you. At the G20 summit in Bali, the leaders declared that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. And at the 2023 non-proliferation treaty BREDCOM, the penultimate draft of the final document, which was finally not adopted, including support for no first-use policies. Might there be a possibility at the upcoming 2024 NPT BREDCOM to repeat the language of the Bali G20 summit and to support the adoption of unilateral, bilateral, and/or multilateral no first-use pledges?
Well, let me say, as I did in my remarks, that I've been interested in the Chinese proposal in this regard, and I do think it's worth exploring. I'm not sure that commitment is in order at this point until we have a better understanding of what the Chinese have in mind, and also how it accords with their current modernization. After all, they're, as I said, building up numbers, and they're also expanding, evidently, beyond what has been their second strike retaliatory posture to a posture where they have ICBMs, yes, but they also have submarine-launched ballistic missiles and bombers, and in other words, a classic triad. So there's a concern, in my view, that somehow they're seeking to achieve a first strike deterrence standoff with the United States. That's what really worries people again in Washington, that suddenly we'll have these two nuclear peers both trying to challenge us for first strike stability. And that, then calls forth these demands for bigger numbers. Again, I don't agree that it's an arithmetic problem, and neither does President Biden and his people. So long story short, I think it's worthwhile to explore this notion, but I'm not sure that we should be ready to make a statement of this kind at the upcoming PrepCon. Okay. It requires some more homework.
I mean, you just said that the current administration does not agree with this arithmetic. That begs obviously the question, would that be different with another administration?
Might be.
Okay.
And that's always the case with the U.S. Presidential, our great democratic system. And by the way, I've already congratulated today South African and Mexican colleagues for the successful conduct of their elections. We've got elections coming up here in Europe. There's always uncertainties that abound when there's a change in administration. But at the moment, I see that we are able. And I want to point to the SBC report, which no matter what will still be on the table when a new administration comes in. And the message there very clearly is that this is not just an arithmetic problem. It's not just about quantity, it's also about quality.
So the strategic posture review, the main messages would kind of remain valid.
It won't be changed, that report won't be changed until the next Strategic Posture Commission in 10 years' time.
Okay, thank you. Let me read out a second online question. What is your assessment of the Russian nuclear drills last month that were described by Russia as a response action by Western countries, including the supply of long-range weapons to Ukraine?
Well, the drills that went on, the so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons drills, for me exacerbated this concern that I mentioned about the the widespread use of dual capable systems, not only in the Ukraine war, but also in Syria, and we see them in other settings as well. So when you see a missile like the Kinjal air-launched ballistic missile being used, the Iskander system, both of which have dual capability, it underscores the uncertainties that arise from dual capable systems being used in wartime. So it seemed to me the Russian Federation was trying to send the message again of, look, anytime now, this could be a nuclear use. And I just think we need to begin to disentangle those missile systems by, I would argue, banning the nuclear variants, at least in peacetime, and perhaps that would be something to negotiate. But, and that would mean banning, the kinds of tests and training that we saw with the Russian exercise last week. So there's something to discuss there. I really think, and again, we need to get back to the negotiating table and talk about these things. But disentangling nuclear from conventional, I think this is a point where we should get serious about talking about it.
Okay.
Okay, back to you.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Garima Singh from Ministry of Defense, India. My question definitely goes to your discussion point where you said that the negotiations have to happen on the two fronts, which is US-Russia and US-Asia. So my question is around that point. India, Pakistan, and China are all pursuing new ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and sea-based missiles. And let's not forget the ambitions of North Korea here. As you said, the negotiations have to happen on two fronts. But I don't think, apart from the P5, these nations, which are actually the Asian nations, the negotiations are working towards creating a new workable model, because their exclusion does not actually lead to a deterrence model when we talk about nuclear arms control. Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting, and I find this a fascinating detail concerning where we have come with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The first time the Americans heard from the Russians that perhaps we should dispense with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, was from Sergei Ivanov back during the second Bush administration in 2007-8, when he was talking to the then Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, and he said, well, maybe, we've got issues around our periphery with a number of countries developing these intermediate range ground launched systems. Perhaps we should just, get rid of the INF treaty. So it was that long ago that there was a suggestion out there from the Russian side of getting out of the treaty. So, and I know that, Roosevelt, not a great enthusiast for arms control treaties, seemed to think about it for a while. But in any event, the reason that I've seen put forward by Russian experts, including by President Putin in 2014, was to say, look, Russia has around its periphery, all around Eurasia, countries developing intermediate range systems. And they included in that list North Korea, China, India, Pakistan, Israel. So, and it was very interesting then that the Kremlin kind of rode back after a while, because after all, China, they're friends, and India, we're friends with them too. And, so it got to be, I remember the point, Pakistan was the only country left on the list. And so the Pakistani ambassador went in and demarched the Russian MFA for putting out this line. But I think it's true that Russia perceived that there was a widespread proliferation of these weapon systems around its periphery, and so was, trying to begin to think about that and thinking about the demise of the INF treaty. So the question is today, where does that leave us? I always think about arms control efforts as being seriatim. And so I think we should start or try to start with, again, the conversation that Xi Jinping and Putin evidently had in Beijing in 2022. Let's think about an Asian moratorium, a European moratorium. Fine, let's think about that. And then maybe further down the road, as the success of implementation produces further stability for the countries involved, maybe other countries such as India, Pakistan, who knows, maybe even North Korea would become involved. But I always think about let's see what we can do step by step and I don't want to say step-by-step approach, but seriatim, to prove the principle, and then if it turns out to be a stabilizing step, others may become interested.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the gentleman over there, and then I will turn to you.
Excellencies, thank you very much for this discussion. Very difficult time, so it's very timely. And
Can
I'm
you
from.
briefly introduce yourself?
My name is Alexei Barbuk. I'm from Permanent Mission of Belarus, also part of Budapest memorandums. And as far as I understand, you participated in developing these documents.
Including several visits to Minsk.
It's very important things. My questions, so this discussion is very high level, unfortunately not less than media. I think that in Stanford you think like Sakharov and Oppenheimer, probably very responsibly about what's happening. And I'm coming to what's going on in science of politicians. According to Reuters, Lithuania's Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis called NATO member states to change their stance with regard to the conflict in Ukraine, since the time is coming when it will be determined whether, as an alliance, are serious about assisting Ukraine to win this war. And he added, I have always been of an opinion that Ukrainians are absolutely capable of defining the targets. I have full confidence that they know and understand what is needed, where the threat comes from. So it was told to the press. His comment was supported by his colleague from Poland, but concurrently Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said today on Monday, the United States could face, quotation marks, fatal consequences if it ignored Moscow's warnings not to let Ukraine use weapons provided by Washington to strike targets inside Russia. And my first question is, why some states...
Only one question.
Okay, there will be only one question. Why Lithuania and Poland, in this example, follow so confidently the line of raising stakes in the Ukrainian conflict by threatening Russia, while these states are in the same boat, in the same position as Belarus, being in between the United States and Russia, who can demonstrate their nuclear potential, hitting these countries as well as Belarus, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before attacking each other directly. So this is my, unfortunately, only question.
Well, it's a doozy. Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, indeed, Belarus was very much part of our negotiations with regard to the trilateral statements. There were trilateral statements and Budapest memoranda with the three states, with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. But Belarus was the first. And Belarus also inscribed in its constitution the idea that it would be a non-nuclear weapon state. I regret very much that it moved away from that constitutional constraint on nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil and accepted evidently, although I haven't seen it prove evidently, the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons on its soil. But that said, your question is a very serious one, and I did want to say a few words about this decision, which just took place at the end of last week by President Biden to allow some use of U.S.-supplied missiles on the soil of or against targets in Russia. It is strictly constrained to so-called counterfire attacks to deny Russia sanctuary for the attacking forces that have been harrowing Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine and the center of Ukraine's high technology industry. There have been constant attacks going on. And so there has been this permission granted to use US missiles to deny the Russians the opportunity to run back across the border or to bring forward additional capabilities, again, to strike at Kharkiv. And there's no change in the US constraint on long-range attacks using missiles supplied by the United States. And that has been very firm and very clear. But I'm making this point to say each NATO country has made some decisions, the ones that are supplying longer range missiles, has made its own decisions. So this is not a NATO-wide decision. The United States and Germany have a very similar position, but other countries, including Lithuania, have essentially given Ukraine, and that was the reference to Mr. Lemsbuda's comment, Ukraine the right to decide targets for itself. But all of the NATO member states have said that Ukraine must stay within the limits of international law, and I know I've been communicating with Kyiv about what that means. So I do not believe that we will see the situation that the scenario that you say might unfold of Belarus and Lithuania being among the first states to take some kind of nuclear use, because I at the current moment, I do not see a nuclear use occurring in this war. I know that many world leaders have been warning against it, and I endorse what they've been doing. President Xi Jinping has been the most prominent of these, and I think that continuing message is going to be really important, because we are at a different moment now in the conflict. But let me just say one final thing about the war in Ukraine. I didn't come here today to talk about the war in Ukraine. If Mr. Putin is serious about freezing the conflict, as he said a week ago on Friday, then the best way to begin would to stop long-range missile attacks against Ukrainian targets, blasting the energy infrastructure and affecting many civilians. Civilians are killed and injured every day in Ukraine. So as a way to express Russian true willingness to begin negotiating, stop the long-range missile attacks, and then let's talk. Okay, that's all I have to say on that.
Thank you very much. One last question, and then we'll have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I'm Pavel Plotnik from Unity. Of your idea about the separating nuclear and non-nuclear systems, it's a very promising idea. We've done some work in this area, but if you are consistent in that approach, at some point there will be an issue of basically withdrawing U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe. Do you think that NATO, the United States, Europe are ready to discuss that, or?
Well, I don't see why that should be if we're talking about missiles.
Why bombers would be any different?
The subject of the negotiation is by agreement of the parties negotiating.
Okay. Okay.
But you ask an important question with regard to, what is the future of other kinds of constraints? Again, seriatim, I say let's start as INF because of the particular nature of INF ground launch systems being very capable, no warning attack assets. Let's talk about them and get some constraints on them first, as was the case with the INF treaty, and then think about if there's anything that needs to be done in future on the air-launched and sea-launched side. Some in the United States would probably hate to hear me say that, but nevertheless, I say, let's do it let's do it seriatim.
All right. That brings us to the end of our conversation. Let me at this point thank those that made this Geneva Security Debate possible. I would like to thank the US mission for facilitating our debate today, my colleagues, Simon, Sasha, Malcolm, for their work. And yeah, of course, I would want to thank you very much, Rose, for a brilliant presentation and for responding to our question in a very candid and substantive way. I think this kind of, again brings back some belief and trust in the potential of nuclear arms control. And I think you're leaving us not with doom and gloom, but with a perspective. I think we have this decade ahead of us that we need to use to bring nuclear arms control back on track. And I think I would like to thank you for this perspective. And again, thank you very much. And we, of course, look very much forward to continuing working with you very closely. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.